Hello, Soundies. Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Today is the 22nd of December 2024. It's good to have you here, and I hope you're all having or had a good week. Well, I guess depending on where in the world you are, this may be the start of the week or the end of the week. In any case, I hope last week was good and that this coming week will be great for you as well. Let's take a look at our agenda here. It's great to hear from all of you here in the chat, by the way. And Dan, we saw your note. I know, I think what you meant to type was Sonar Works, and you're probably on your phone, so we understand. Today we're going to talk about near-field monitors and some considerations for setting them up. Why not just use headphones? Why near-field monitors as well? And then when you are setting them up, what are all the things you need to consider? And how are you going to get sound that you can trust, sound that you can make critical mixing decisions? And of course, we're doing all of this primarily with a focus on dialogue audio, but a lot of this stuff obviously applies as well to music and sound effects and so on and so forth. Thank you to MACKIE, who sent over the MACKIE CR5BT monitors. They are affordable monitors that are meant for project studio. I think that kind of the term you'll hear is project studios, meaning you should be able to use them for reference monitoring, for mixing. But they also have kind of a couple of tricks up their sleeves, if you will. And we'll talk about those in the context of using near-field monitors from a larger perspective. Okay, and then I guess one of the questions we're looking to answer here as well is, my typical monitoring setup is 2 focal Solo 6 beryllium monitors, which sit here and here, plus the associated subwoofer. And the question is, that's a very expensive setup. That's a $4,700 near-field monitor setup. How does that compare to the $200 kit of the MACKIE CR5BT? How big of a difference is it? Does it make a difference? Can you get away with something that's much more affordable? I think you probably know the answer to that, but that's what we're going to talk about today. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in, and let's just go ahead and show you first the monitor itself. So if we go to the overhead camera here, it's on its side right now, of course, but I wanted you to be able to see the whole thing. It's just to give you a sense of scale. I have a very large hand, and these are the 5-inch versions of the CR Generation 3 monitors from MACKIE. Obviously, it's a 2-driver design, so we have a tweeter up on the top here, and then we have a 5-inch woofer here. And they also come in a variety of different configurations. In fact, if we switch over to the Mac here, you'll see, let me just go back here. They have a 3.5-inch version, a 3.5-inch with Bluetooth version. The BT stands for Bluetooth. A 4.5-inch and a 4.5-inch Bluetooth version. We're using these here, the CR5BT, the 5-inch with Bluetooth. And then they also have an 8-inch version. And they also have an associated subwoofer. I did not get the subwoofer for this test. We just have the 5-inch monitors, but just for reference. Now, MACKIE is sort of pitching these as your everything speakers. And the idea here is, if we go back to the overhead really quickly, let me show you kind of one of the main features here, is there's this dial on the front, and you get to choose your tone, work or play. And the idea here is that when you have it set to work, it's actually continuously variable between those two, and there's an ident here in the middle, meaning kind of a spot where you can feel it kind of catch. The work is for referencing, and the idea here is that it should be a bit more of a linear frequency response across the spectrum. It should be more honest. It should be something that you can trust a little bit more as far as the overall audio that's coming out. If you go to the play, what you're getting there is you're getting something that perhaps sounds a bit nicer. So it's going to be a little bit more forgiving for whatever or whatever audio is being sent to it, and make it kind of flatter it a little bit. And the way these things typically work, and based on my ears and listening to it, what it's doing in those cases is that it is kind of essentially applying an EQ curve such that the mid-range is kind of cut just a little bit, and the bass and the high frequencies maybe boosted just a touch. So that kind of very typical U-shaped EQ curve. So if it's a low frequencies down here, they may be a little bit boosted, cut in the mids, and then again back up in the highs. So that's the main idea here. So if you want to play if you're going to be, breakdancing, or you're going to be listening to your hip hop and you want a little bit more bass response, you can go to play mode. So that's kind of the overview. Obviously over here we have the volume knob, as well as that's the power on. So that kind of snaps to turn the power on, and then there's a 3.5 millimeter output. This also is a button right here, the MACKIE insignia. This is your Bluetooth, and the little ring around here lights up to green when you're connected via Bluetooth. So you can send a Bluetooth signal to these as well. So the idea here is that for $200, you should be able to get a set of monitors. It's actually both. Usually when you're looking at professional monitors, you buy them, they sell them in singles. So you have to buy however many you need. In this case, it comes with two. And the idea here is you should be able to use it for mixing, but you should also be able to use it for pleasure. And if you want to put it on your desk to use for mixing, there's a setting on the back, and we'll see that in just a minute. And there's a separate setting for if you want to put it, say, for example, on a bookshelf, or you're going to be listening at a little bit more distance. So it kind of, I'm not 100% sure what that does, but it sounds definitely louder when you switch it to the bookshelf mode versus the near field monitor mode. In a monitor at this price range, you're typically looking at a Class D amplifier built in. So there is an amplifier built into the primary monitor. The satellite monitor is much lighter weight. It doesn't have an amplifier inside of it, and you're literally just connecting the primary monitor via a little cable, speaker cable like this, from the primary monitor to the secondary monitor. And you feed the audio from if you're mixing, from your audio interface to the primary monitor here. Okay, so that's a quick look there. Let me take a look at the back here. Actually, before we switch, Danny, let me show the back as well. Okay, so one thing you'll notice here right away, we have this big ring here. It's basically a hole. It is a bass port. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Here's a power on and off switch back here. The power cable comes in here. It is not a wall wart, so that means that any power supply is built into the monitor, which is nice, so you don't have a separate thing sitting out there cluttering up your space. And then you have inputs. So first of all, we have balanced inputs. It says balance / the TRS says balance / unbalanced. So you can bring either in, but of course I'm bringing in balanced from our audio interface on 1/4 inch TRS inputs. You also have some RCA inputs here too. So you could hook up like old school hi-fi systems, things like that, and come straight in here. There's also a 3.5 millimeter input. So if you're bringing it straight from your computer, you could do that as well. So you don't even have to have an audio interface necessarily. Of course, these are both unbalanced here. Here's that little switch I was telling you about before, where you can choose whether you are using the monitors as near field monitors, say for example on your desk, or as bookshelf monitors at more distance. And that's that switch there. You have one more switch here, and this switch here lets you configure whether the primary monitor or the main monitor is the left or the right in your stereo pair. That's pretty handy, because then you're not tied to always having the primary monitor in one position. Usually it's a left monitor, but if it's easier and more convenient for you to have this closer to a power outlet and configure this as the right monitor, you can do that as well, because that's a nice little feature. And then as I mentioned before, here are the outputs that go to the secondary monitor, again using just standard speaker cable right here with these little friction clips that you've probably seen on hi-fi speakers before. And that's all there is to it. That's the tour. Just to give you a sense, it's probably made out of some, I would assume, some engineered wood material with a veneer on it. Kind of a black grain, wood grain looking thing. And again, this is the generation 3. They've been making these for quite a while. And this is their 3rd generation that came out just recently. Okay, let's go back to our agenda here. So that was the tour. Woofer diameter. So there are all these different models. Why? Well, price is one thing. But in essence, what the woofer diameter will generally correspond with is that the speaker's ability, well, a couple things. It will determine where the crossover is between when the audio is coming into your speakers, and you have a 2-driver system like this with a tweeter and a woofer. at some point they have to decide, okay, the woofer's going to play roughly these frequencies and the tweeter's going to play these frequencies. And when you get different size woofers, that crossover is going to be at slightly different places. And arguably, that crossover, sometimes you would prefer not to have that right at the critical listening area, which is often the case in 2-driver monitors. But that's one consideration. And again, I'm not an expert on all of this and crossover networks and exactly how they're designed and so on and so forth. But that's one thing. And then the other thing is that larger woofers can generally produce lower frequency audio output. They can generate lower frequencies. So normally what I would recommend is, for most monitors, I would probably recommend a 5-inch if you're working in a small room. I've had 8-inch monitors in this little room here, and frankly, it was probably a bit much for this room. And that was before I was doing any sort of monitor calibration or room correction, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So that's one thing. So the smaller ones are not going to be able to produce the lower frequencies quite as much. Base ports, which we talked about before. So the reason that you'll see base ports on a lot of monitors, and if we switch back over to the overhead here, this is the base port. The base port will typically enable the monitor to produce lower frequency sounds. It actually lets the monitor breathe a little bit. Now, that's a good and a bad thing. There's some costs associated with that. Now, as soon as you have a hole in the monitor where air can move in and out, you're probably going to get some resonant frequencies. And so designing a quality base port there's quite a bit of engineering involved. And perhaps some, you have to be pretty careful when you get to the engineering or the manufacturing standpoint as well. You don't want things rattling. You want to make sure that you're avoiding resonances, so that on really inexpensive, poorly designed speakers, if they do have bass ports, sometimes you'll get a sort of one-note bass kind of effect where everything that's bass, say 100 hertz and lower, all sounds the same. It's all at the same frequency. It's all played back at, say, maybe 80 hertz. So everything just gets kind of muddled. You can't really tell. You can't distinguish between the frequencies in some of those cases. And where you place the port is also a factor here. In this case, they're on the back. I've seen lots of discussion back and forth about whether it's best to have the port on the back or the front. Some of the cons with having it on the back, or at least some people say, is that if you're working in an untreated room, now you're setting some of those bass frequencies into the corners of the room, presumably, and that's where bass can build up and really start to create problems. So that's one perspective. You can also, in some monitors, in fact, on my Solo 6Bs, the port is on the front here. So at least in those cases, they say that it's less likely to create as many of those problems. I don't really know the answer to that, to be honest. But those are some of the kind of arguments that you see, or the discussion, dialogue, or whatever online. Hopefully people keep it civil and it's just dialogue. But in any case, all right, so those are the base ports. Next thing here, we talked about the inputs already, so I think we're good on that. So you have both balanced and unbalanced. The only difference on a lower-end monitor like this is that a lot of the higher-end monitors will have 1/4-inch and XLR inputs for balanced inputs. This one just has 1/4-inch. I think this one is a very, very inexpensive monitor, near field, like a reference monitor. So I think they were definitely looking to save money and keep the price down and affordable and reachable for a lot of people. So that's probably why you only have 1/4-inch inputs on here. But that's fine. You may just need to adapt your cable, depending on what you have coming out of your audio interface or whatever you're coming from. We covered the switches already as well. So we have the left-right switch to choose which the monitor is, and also the listening position switch, whether you're on your desktop or not. We talked about the work play dial. I've been using these for about 2 weeks now, and kind of been back and forth between those. So when I'm maybe doing my exercise, watching a show, I'll switch it over to the play mode. Your ears get attuned to it pretty quickly. So there definitely is more bass when you switch it to the play mode. Kind of emphasizes the bass a bit more, and some of the high frequencies. Work mode, though, definitely where you want to be for mixing. Let's talk a little bit about what you don't get at this price point. We already talked about the inputs, so you're less likely to have both XLR and 3.5, or sorry, TRS inputs. But actually at this price point, because they're tailoring it more towards people that may want to use this monitor for multiple purposes, for pleasure as well as for work, you actually got more ports in some ways. So you got the unbalanced inputs, you got the RCA inputs, you could hook up a hi-fi system if that's what it has as an output. You have a 3.5 millimeter input, don't have that on the Pro monitors for sure. You have a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack if you want to use that. So if you're feeding audio directly from your computer via its headphone jack to the 3.5 millimeter input on this, then you still have a port available to use for headphones if you're going to switch back and forth between them. So that's helpful. Yeah, so that's kind of a cover. So it's really just clear that they're marketing this particular speaker or monitor towards a different group, somebody that wants to do some of both without having to have two separate sets of speakers. All right, big question. Are they accurate? Are they flat in terms of flat frequency response? And the answer is kind of complicated. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. So the reality is that a lot of people don't talk about is that speakers are only really half of the equation. The other half is your room, the space in which you place the speakers and where you position yourself relative to the speakers and how you set them up, what you set them on, what height they're at relative to your ears. There are a lot of factors. And whether or not your room is treated, whether or not you're using room correction of some sort. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute here. So the short answer is that for $200 monitors, and I'll show you this in just a little bit, and Danny and I were talking this morning, it's always a little, talking about monitors, reviewing monitors is a little tricky because you can't, you could just set a microphone up in front of them and play back the same thing from multiple monitors, but that's not really helpful because you're hearing the room as well, which is not, it's not like you can isolate just the monitor itself unless you had an anechoic chamber, which we do not have. So, so I'm not going to just play these back for you, but what I did do instead was I used essentially a room calibration system to get a read on these relative to my focals, and we'll take a look at that in just a minute. So let's do that right now. In fact, let me actually, before I do that, let's go back to the overhead camera. Let me tell you just a little bit about this room calibration. So I'll move the monitor out of the way. IK Multimedia makes something they call ARC Studio. ARC stands for Advanced Room Correction. And this is the newer version of that. It comes in a kit with a measurement microphone and the hardware itself. And you've heard me probably, for those that have followed the channel for a while, have heard me talk about SonarWorks before. This is a similar type thing, except whereas SonarWorks, at least traditionally, was more of a hardware measurement but software room correction solution. This one is, obviously there's a hardware for measuring the room, but there is hardware for playback as well. So in other words, in the case of Sound ID reference from SonarWorks, you have to run an app on your computer from which you're playing back the sound. That, this is out of focus, okay, because it's sitting so much farther down. Now we're in focus, okay. So whereas you'd have to run an app on your computer that kind of inserts itself into the audio chain in the operating system itself, instead, with Arc Studio, you actually do the room readings, and then the software installs basically an EQ curve onto the hardware, and then you never have to run software again. You just connect this, and actually just show you. You input your audio from your audio interface here, and then send the outputs on this to your speakers, your near-field monitors, and this does the correction. So you don't have to run an app on your computer, which is really, really nice. In terms of latency, I have not noticed any latency at all with this. And in fact, it can go into a passive mode as well. So you can turn off the correction if you have it powered on. You can turn off the correction and it still plays back. And that's actually really useful to hear the difference between a calibrated and non-calibrated playback. And then also, if it's not even powered on, I've noticed it still passes through the audio. So, although it is somewhat attenuated. So that's how this generally works. And so let me just hook this up really quickly so I can show you the app and what readings we got, measuring both the MACKIE CR5BTs and the Focal Solo 6Bs plus a subwoofer in this same room here. And I measured them independently, of course, because I had to have both of them in the same listening position. So let me just hook this up, get this powered on here, and I'm going to connect it via USB to my computer. So it just has a little USB-C port on the back here, and that's so that you can have it communicate with the app that took the measurements and program those measurements onto here for correction. Okay. So we can see it's powered on here, and as I mentioned before, there are just a couple LEDs here. So power LED signal, when you're running signal through here, this will kind of glow up and down with the intensity of the signal, and then you can turn the correction on or off with that simple button there. Okay, so let's go over to the Mac really quickly. Okay, so what this is showing here, let me just turn off the correction really quickly. When we did a reading with the included reference microphone, and by the way, let's switch to the main camera for just a second. This is a little plastic microphone, and it has a MEMS capsule in here. If you're not familiar with MEMS, it's basically a microphone capsule and a bunch of electronics all on one little unit. And they're actually coming, this is the kind of thing that you normally see in your laptop or in your phone. MEMS microphones have come a long way, and I actually think it's pretty impressive now that they can use these as reference microphones. So what they can do is, once they're manufactured, I don't know what exactly IK Multimedia does, but they can actually tune them. They can, for example, put them in a small anechoic chamber and actually electronically tune the response of the microphone. So they can send a sweep through there and actually get it tuned in for that particular unit. So that's the idea here, is that this has already been calibrated. Okay, now with that, back to the Mac. So this was the measurements that we got in our room here. And you can see here, for example, that there's this massive, massive hump here at about 120, 130 hertz, and it's showing both speakers. So that you can see there are differences between the speakers as well, which has to do with time alignment and position. So those are some challenges. And then you can see that there's this massive dip at, what is it, 90, between 80 and 90 hertz. And then there's this bump here. So this is 50, about between 60 and 70 hertz. There's it's closer to where it should be, but then there's this massive drop and so on and so forth. So this is just representing the reality of many speakers and their corresponding room in which they're playing back. So this is not unusual at all, especially for this price range. That's pretty standard. Let me just show you this is the Focals. This is their raw reading. And you can see, first of all, that they can produce, obviously with the subwoofer, we can produce a bass much, much lower frequencies, down to about, what's this, about 35, 40 hertz, roughly, somewhere in there. And then we, of course, do have this huge bump again. This is probably largely a characteristic of the room, and that's gonna show through on both the MACKIE and on the Focals. But you can see overall the Focals are probably just right out of the box in this room, in this space, which is acoustically treated. They're probably a little bit more even, not quite as wild, although there is this huge bump here. This is an 8 or 9 dB kind of variance from where it should be, roughly. So that's pretty substantial. So the question is what happens when we apply? Well, let's go back to these are the Focals. Here is what it looks like after we've applied the Arc Studio to do the room correction. So in other words, it's applying an EQ curve to playback in the room. And this is what the response looks like then. So it's a lot more even. Yes, we still have some bumps and some dips and peaks. But overall, this is going to be a lot closer to where we want it to be able to make mixing decisions. And then with the Mackies, we were able to get it to here. So again, it's not able to reach quite as low into the bass frequencies, and we still have this pretty substantial dip here of about 5 dB, 4 or 5 dB, around 100 hertz, kind of surrounding 100 hertz, but definitely closer. And I would say that this is something that I feel like I could trust when I'm doing some mixing. Is it ideal? Is it as nice as the vocals? No. But is it something that I could trust and get the job done with? I feel like the answer to that is yes. And then again, back to what the vocals look like once they're corrected. So the idea is you want to have as little variance as possible throughout the entire spectrum. And again, here's where we started with the vocals. And here, the green is where we started with the Mackies and where we ended up with the Mackies. So that is my attempt to answer the question, are they accurate? Are they flat? Can you trust them? And how do they compare to the vocals with a much larger price tag, the $4,500 larger price tag? So paying an additional $4,500, what do you get? You get a little bit more bass. You get a slightly more even frequency response. I think subjectively, I would say that it's hard to say because they do sound a little different. Obviously, they're smaller woofers and they didn't have a subwoofer to go along with them. The ideal would is if I could get that woofer as well, which I don't have from Mackie. But I think overall, what I would say is that you definitely can have a richer experience with the vocals. That's what you're going to get for that additional money. But is it going to be a night and day difference? Not really night and day. I wouldn't say. There's a difference, but it's not. I feel like the frequencies are easier to pick out. So when we do our ear training and we're like, okay, what happened here? Where are you hearing something different? Did I cut or did I boost, and at what frequency? I can do that better on the solos than I can with the Mackies, but the Mackies are much better than a lot of other inexpensive or affordable speakers that I've heard before in terms of being able to hear the separation between those frequencies and being able to identify it. Okay, I want to also talk about another thing. Positioning is really important as well. How and where you position the speakers is important. Actually, why don't we take a break? I've been talking for a long time. We're going to take a break and check in on the chat, and I'll come back to that. But let's see what questions or thoughts you all have so far on this topic. I hope you're finding this interesting. I hope it's useful to you. All right, New York Dogs has a note here. New York Dog says, I hope third gen is better than first. I've had some problems with one speaker's breaking, and I gave up on Mackie. Okay, fair enough. Thanks for the feedback. I don't know. I've just had it for a few weeks. I would pay good money to see Curtis Judd Audio breakdancing. Would you? How much would you pay, Matt? I'm not sure breakdancing is a tall man's sport either, by the way. Fachiri, do you think monitor setups need a subwoofer like the Yamaha HS8s or the JBL LSR 310s? I think it depends on what you're mixing. I will say this: I've heard a lot of mixes on YouTube, primarily dialogue pieces, where it was clear that the people mixed on earbuds or something like that because there are about 1 million plosives and they evidently didn't hear them while they were mixing. So, do you need a subwoofer? I don't think you need a subwoofer necessarily for straight up dialogue mixing, but I just think there's some things you have to be careful of. I think if you're mixing just dialogue, then I would also almost always use a low cut or a high pass filter to make sure you're getting rid of any stuff that you may not be hearing and that isn't relevant to the dialogue itself. That's the first thing. If you're doing full mixes of music and sound effects and all of that, I think that's where a subwoofer becomes more important. However, bass is a tricky thing. And managing your room is a tricky thing. So we're going to come to this question in a little bit, but there's more to consider. So do I think they need them? It depends on what you're doing. If you're just mixing dialogue, probably not. If you're doing full mixes with music and everything else, then you might want to consider it. But there's some other things you need to add too. Okay, next question. Also, would you choose these over the JBL 305Ps? So the JBLs those are, by the way, Danny, those are little monitors upstairs in the, those are a little bit different. They're radial monitors, so they have the tweeter in the middle of the woofer, but it is a 2-driver design. they're pretty impressive for what they are, but I would probably choose the Mackies over those just because I felt like subjectively the Mackies covered more of the spectrum. I could hear more with them. Yeah, that was how I'd put it. Matt says, I agree with the port on the front for a number of reasons. Yes, this is a long-standing, there's a lot of information about this. Go ahead. Audio buff. When you are used to a larger format speaker, it's hard to listen to small near-field monitors. They sound more restrictive, but it's amazing how big of a sound smaller speakers can have. I could not agree more, audio buff. And audio buff is probably coming from listening to line arrays in big venues. Very different experience than, of course, near-field monitors. So, yeah. Robert Shoji, is the headphone output affected by the work play control? Ooh, good question. I didn't specifically test that. I would think so, but I don't know for sure. See if you'd have to see if the site says anything about that. Yeah, I don't know the answer. Sorry, Robert. Dan says, with SonarWorks, and for an example, I use Audient, I don't know how you say it. Is it Oriya or Oriya? That you send the calibration file to the hardware and not need to use the app. Oh, great point. Okay, so Dan, that's a great point. So SonarWorks is now integrating with a number of different audio interface manufacturers so that they can put the correction EQ curve into the audio interface, so you don't need a separate piece of hardware. Audient is one that's doing that. Universal Audio just released their new Apollos. All the Apollos can do that now too, or at least some of the Apollos, the new generation Apollos can do that. So that makes it so you don't need a separate piece of hardware like the Arc Studio. So I think that's a wise choice on SonarWorks, because that was the biggest complaint I had about it, is running it as an app on your computer. It didn't work a lot of the time, which was very frustrating. So it's nice to see them moving that into the audio interface where possible. Kevin, watched your videos for ages, but first time able to join a stream. Just wanted to say thanks so much for all the content over the years. So helpful and even entertaining for us nerds. Kevin, thank you so much. Glad you could join us today, and great to have you here as well. Mark, are you testing with pink noise when using the Arc device, or does it have its own signal generator? So it has an app that you run that has its own signal generator. It does a frequency sweep. You put the mic in 21 different positions. You kind of follow the directions. It just walks you through it, and you start with it right near your listening position, and then you move it off to the different sides and forward and back a little bit, and then you do that at different layers as well, so different heights, for a total of 27 or 21 different positions. So yeah, it does that for you, and then you load that into the Arc Studio. It's a pretty easy process. It just takes a little bit of time. Audio buff. When I worked in a recording studio, I would mix on the reference monitors and then listen to my mix on earbuds, car speakers, and home speakers. I tried to get an average sound. That's a great point that you bring up. And that's like when you go into recording studios, oftentimes you'll see multiple sets of monitors. And the reason for that is that they're trying to kind of make sure they're double checking their ears, accommodate the fact that people are going to be listening back on different things. So listening on earbuds can be very helpful. Listening in your car, although every car is a little bit different, listening on any sort of home hi-fi system or Bluetooth speakers, whatever you have available to you, that can be super helpful to get a sense for how the mix that you've worked on with your near-field monitors is translating to other things. And that's where I found my focals have been really, really good. And my last few videos that went on my main channel got mixed on the Mackie as well. And they seem to translate pretty well from my experience so far. So Danny, are you Curtis Judd manager that I need to make an offer to? LOL. This is regarding breakdancing. I've never breakdanced in my life. So if you wanted to see that, Matt, it's not going to be it's going to be a short show. But yeah, talk to Danny if you'd like to make an offer. DaVinci Girl, we just did have the monitor discussion in the German DaVinci Resolve group. A guy did wish to buy a monitor set to improve his sound in impossible room. My husband did suggest him to invest in room correction and headphone, his room under the roof. Yeah, so that's one of the questions that I'm glad you brought that up, DaVinci Girl. the question that a lot of people say, hey, I have, we talked about room. Here's the question that people have a lot of times. Switch to the agenda here real quick. I have X dollars. What should I do to get the best sound? And, you know, sometimes it depends on where you're at, if you're renting versus you own your place, and, you know, how much you can actually hang things on walls or what. But my perspective is do what you can, and don't sweat it too much, but definitely listen to your mixes on other speakers just to see how well they're translating, just as Audio Buff mentioned. I think the ideal is room acoustic treatment plus room correction plus quality monitors is the ideal. Obviously, headphones as well. I don't want to make the impression or give the impression that I only mix in near-field monitors. I do a mix of headphones and monitors, and I just find that sound blankets is another thing you can do as well on a temporary basis, which is nice. The only problem with sound blankets is they don't attenuate the bass frequencies as much, so that can still be a little tricky. And I found a lot of times in small rooms, bass tends to be the issue, and being able to distinguish what's happening with bass. And we saw that on the measurement of the MACKIE monitors, is that bass is the hardest thing to get right when you're working in a small room on a budget set of monitors. But the MACKIEs did, I think, they did just as well as the KRK Rocket 8s that I used to have. So they did, you know, and they're substantially less expensive, less than half the price of those monitors, if I remember right. So I think those were $250 per monitor. This was $200 for the kit. So in any case, my perspective is do everything you can, but also don't sweat it. Like if you can only mix on headphones, well, get started on that. But be very careful and make sure when you finished your mix, go play it back on other things and just see how it translates. See how it sounds different than when you were mixing on your headphones. And you may have to accommodate based on that. In the ideal world, what I do is I typically will do the initial dialogue cleanup in headphones where I want to hear every little lip smack and all of that stuff, be able to clean that stuff up. And then a lot of times I'll switch then to the monitors so I can hear what it sounds like in a space, in an actual space. The reality is, too, that we haven't talked about yet is that a lot of people are listening on different devices now. We have people listening on their phone speakers, tablet speakers, televisions, earbuds, all sorts of wireless headphones of different sorts, and wired headphones. Some people are listening on hi-fi systems. Some people are listening to live streams on 7.1 Atmos calibrated rooms. So you're getting a whole range of people playing back on different things, and you want to try and provide the best experience for all of those. The easiest is probably going to be able to accommodate those that are listening on phone speakers and earbuds. Although there's some quality earbuds out there too. So anyway, that was some thoughts there. Let's go back to the chat. Anything else in the chat that we want to cover here? At my office that I do miss, I had Neumann KH150 AES67 monitors, very good. Yeah, Neumann does not make junky stuff for sure. And those, it sounds like digital input monitors. So you were sending a digital signal to the monitors as opposed to an analog. All right, Robert, do you think the measured response of your focal is the way the speaker was designed or a result of the room interaction? Yes, it's a result of both. And I think that's the biggest point I want people to take away from this is when you're talking about what sound you're getting, it's not just the speaker. It is the speaker plus the room and the position of this speakers in the room. Another thing we haven't talked about, so short version, Robert, yes, it's both. It's not one or the other. It's both. And then the other thing too is we haven't talked about this, but you do need to isolate your monitors from whatever surface you have them sitting on in as much as possible. There are foam isolators you can use. I don't know how well those work. I've used those in the past. That's what I started with. ISO Acoustics makes a little product that is supposed to isolate better by, in any case, I don't know the answers to that. I mean, I don't know. I don't have the ultimate answer and definitive, scientifically, this is what you should be doing. But what I would say about everything that we talk about today, a lot of this I learned from, stuff online, but I think probably the best resource I've seen is Acoustics Insider online. And let me see if I can pull that up. but Acoustics Insider. Yeah, we can switch to the Mac here. So Acoustics Insider, they have a weekly, well, not weekly, kind of a periodic email list that they send out, plus a whole bunch of information over here on their site, talking about, you know, how do you measure your room? In this case, it looks like they're using Room EQ Wizard right here with a waterfall plot, setting up a new studio, bass traps, lots of good information, you know, control down to 40 hertz, how to manage bass, what are the 80-20 basement acoustics if you're going to in a small basement studio like I am. What can you do? What do you do if you're in a low ceiling in an attic? Lots of great information about this over on the blog, and they also have some courses. So definitely recommend that if you really want to nerd out on this whole topic. Okay, next up. Oh, not line array, point source. I'm sorry. Okay, so you're using all point source speakers. Line arrays, by the way, if you haven't heard of what a line array is, line array, when you go to the bigger concerts, this is what you're going to find. Let's just see what we get here. I want images. Okay, let's cut to the Mac here. So you'll often see things like this suspended from the big canopy on the stage, and they're usually curved like this. And the idea with line arrays is that you want to be able to provide a similar experience for the people in the front of the audience and the back of the audience. Because if you have a single speaker on each side pointed down and kind of optimized towards the mixing position, then the people in the front are going to hear something different and the people in the back are going to hear something different. So here's a pretty big line array there. And in fact, they had these when we went to the Joe Bonamassa concert a few weeks ago in the venue that we were in. So they usually, here you can see they're suspended. What looks like for some sort of, this looks like some sort of stadium. But that's the idea of the line array. Did you go? By the way, Curtis, do you have a MIDI keyboard or can get one? In this case, we have a nice software bought for you for Christmas. Well, thank you. I do have a MIDI keyboard, a little Akai. You do not need to be able to play keyboard. Okay, cool. Yes, let's get in touch via email. The Tech Preacher, great channel. I learned a lot from you. Thank you so much, Tech Preacher, for coming by today. And glad to hear that things have helped here. All right, compared to Genelex, what's the best bang for buck? Oh, it's Guy. Good to hear from you, Guy Cochran. I haven't done extensive work, but what I did is when I bought my Focals, I went to the local pro audio shop and they had a little mixing room set up. And they had a ton of different monitors that we were able to A/B listen to. Took my phone with a bunch of music on it that was and some dialogues that recordings that I was very familiar with, and we played it back from all these different sets of speakers. And there were some Atom monitors in there, and the Atoms sounded very good too. By the way, they have a different type of tweeter. They have a kind of a ribbon tweeter, very different design. But it was the Focals that really stood out and that sounded like the best bang for buck for me. In other words, what I was listening for was, can I distinguish all of the instruments in the case of music, clearly identify all of the different instruments, because these are tracks that I've listened to that I'm familiar with and that I am very familiar with. So I know what I'm trying to listen for. So that's how I approached it. We did listen to some Genelex as well. Genelex are pretty expensive, as are the Focals. But I think there's a lot of them out there that are really good. The Atoms really impressed me. Genelex obviously impressed me. The Focals impressed me. It came down to just tiny little things beyond that. So then I've looked at a few different of these really small monitors. Actually, I will say this. Some years ago, I did a comparison of Yamaha, JBL, KRK, At the time, Focal also had their Alpha line. I don't think they have that anymore, but these were sort of like more kind of mid-range priced monitors. And of those, I think the ones I was least impressed with actually were the JBLs. And actually, I have JBLs for work with 8-inch woofers. They're actually just sitting here and here. They're really harsh in the mid-range, more so than I think the actual mix is. It played back on lots of other speakers. I don't get that harshness that I get with the JBLs. So I guess I would say Focal has some less expensive ones. They're not that inexpensive. The less expensive ones would probably still, for a stereo setup of just 2 monitors, the Shapes, I think is what they call them, is the model name. The Shapes are also sounded very good. I think you're probably looking at least $1,000 for a setup of those, a stereo setup. So it's a hard question to answer, Guy, but those are some thoughts.
Was the room treatment?
Oh, great resource. Yeah, definitely for Acoustics Insider. Absolutely. Great resource there. With Point Source, we custom design the horns and woofers to meet the needs of the room with the needs of the user. That's a great point. So Audio Buff, it'd be great to hear your talk about speaker design. Because obviously, as you're professionally, for those that are not aware, Audio Buff does the installation and custom speaker design and manufacturing and installation for House of Worship, primarily, but also I don't know if you do other things other than House of Worship as well, but so he's tuning those specifically for the specific rooms. Usually they want something that's not quite so imposing at a church or a synagogue or any other house of worship. So they're probably not going to want massive, massive line arrays unless they're a mega church, maybe. Maybe in some cases there they do, but a lot of times they're going to want something that's a little less intrusive. And I'm sure there's a lot that goes into the kind of design of those. It's really interesting. Would love to hear about it sometime.
There's some interesting discussion.
Sounds like there's some good discussion going on. Let me just go through here. Oh, we did have some questions. Let's get to our questions that were submitted ahead of time. They're actually, some of them are related to this. Some are different things. So from Hildo, I'm wondering if you heard anything about the DLZ because I was expecting way more updates and not much has changed yet. So I haven't heard of any well, if I had heard of something that hadn't been released yet, I'd probably be under non-disclosure agreement. So I couldn't tell you anyway, but I can tell you that I'm not under non-disclosure agreement. So I'm not aware of any changes that are coming. I guess what I would ask is what kind of things are you looking for in changes or updates to the DLZ? And I think they have a MACKIE Discord group. If you're interested, you might go look that up and see. I think they were taking feature requests there, so you might check that out. Hopefully that's helpful for you. Martin says, when I was recording engineer in Nashville, I remember that URI time-aligned speakers were very popular as the main control room speakers, and they did sound more focused, and near-field monitors were often Auratones. Have you heard of that brand recently? Yes, I have. They certainly were wonderful reference monitors. You could turn the main volume very low, and if you could still hear every track through the Auratones, you know that you likely had a good mix. So the context in which I've heard them is that the Auratones, they have these mix cubes, and they're a little cube box, wood box, with a single driver, a single woofer, and that's it. And the idea with those is that they were really good for, number one, checking to make sure that your mix translated to mono, if you could send it to just one of those, but also to kind of give yourself a real world look at how your mix was going to translate in a lot of other places. So for example, if you mix something and your music is playing back at a grocery store, you're not getting a 714 Atmos mix at the grocery store. I guarantee you, they're piping it into mono speakers that are spaced throughout the different aisles in the store, and that's what you get. So you have to make sure that your mix is going to translate in those cases, and that's where those Auratones were really, really useful. Is that I think maybe grocery stores are better than they used to be in terms of their sound installation, but I don't think they necessarily invest heavily there. And so that was one of the things and it's also good if someone's listening back on their phone speakers, having an Aurotone was good because it gave you a limited frequency response across the overall frequency hearing range. So it kind of was very mid-range focused, and it gave you a sense for how is my mix translating in those cases. So Martin, thank you for that. That was a nice walk down memory lane. And yes, I think if it's not the same company, it's another company that kind of picked up with the name and is running with it. So they have their mixed cubes now. All right, David says, I applaud your campaign to discourage manufacturers of good quality audio devices from using non-replaceable batteries, thus rendering the whole device disposable. What are your views on RTC timecode quick boot batteries? How long do they usually last? I accept that these batteries are probably necessarily embedded, but having to return them to the manufacturer for this to be carried out is irksome. So for those that are not familiar what David's talking about specifically, in some of the higher end recorder mixers, especially those that have time code generators in them, they do have a battery that is built into them that is typically a rechargeable battery. And the way it works is that when you power on your unit, you're using the primary battery, the external battery, to power on the unit and charge the time code clock within the device itself. And in fact, a lot of people have complained about this. In the Zoom F6 and the Zoom F8N Pro, evidently they're using very small capacity batteries because if you don't power those on at least once a week, then every time you turn on your device, it tells you you have to reset the date and the time. And a lot of people are frustrated by that. But that's probably because they're using a relatively small battery that's not holding a charge for more than a few hours. Or more than a few days, I should say. So in any case, what's my thought on that? I mean, David, I'm just trying to solve one problem at a time. Yeah, it's a pain. Could they design it otherwise? Yeah. Would it cost a lot more? I don't know. Probably cost more. I don't know how much more. So I have not had one completely die on me yet. I have had computers, incidentally, on their motherboards typically have a similar type thing to keep time when they're powered down. I have had a motherboard battery die before, so yeah, they'll eventually not stop holding a charge. So, but yeah, it's an irksome thing. But my perspective is, I wish there was another way. I don't know what that way is. So you have to have a bridge battery so that when you're replacing the primary power source to the recorder mixer, that the time code clock, or the real time clock can continue to count. So that's why they do the separate battery. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer. Okay, that's it. Let's go to the chat again. And we have just a few more minutes. So if you have a question, if you want to tag it with that Curtis Judd Audio, would love to see that before we wrap up here today. Vicky, there have been no new firmware updates for the DLZ. I mod the Discord group. Oh, Vicky. Well, great. Okay, good to know. And thanks for the update. But I would be curious still from Hildo what kind of updates he was expecting. I think the one thing that I've seen is some people would like to see a little bit more flexibility in terms of assigning what goes to each of the faders, the physical faders. And on the DLZ XS, the smaller version, being able to reassign one of the rotary faders to become a master fader. Those are kind of the things that I've heard of that people want. I think people may also want virtual devices and other stuff too. I don't know, but anyway, some thoughts there. Okay, thanks, Vicky, and thanks for moderating that. But Sherry, off topic, but would you or anyone else have any idea how to mic a live band with a low number of mics? Not critical. It sounds amazing. Thanks. Well, there are a lot of traditional music recordings that are made with one microphone, and anywhere between 1 to 10 different instrumentalists, and they sound fantastic. So I think the space, you're going to be constrained by space because it's going to be a live band. I assume they're going to be performing in front of a crowd. I would probably just use a condenser microphone with a variable pattern where you could switch it maybe to wide cardioid and put them in a semicircle around there is the first thought that comes to my mind, depending on I don't know which instruments you're talking about, but that's how I would generally approach it for at least a traditional band, which is mostly strings. Maybe a hand drum type thing. But love to hear anyone else's input. And also, Fachiri, if you could tell us a little bit about the band. What instruments, vocals, what's their configuration there? All right, Danny's scanning through the chat. There's a lot going on, it sounds like, which is good. Happy to hear that there's good, healthy conversation in the community.
This has to do with the Genelex.
Oh, regarding Genelex, DaVinci Girl. I do not know which model I have. Maybe I can tell you more. I did send a picture. I'm a woman and not much interested in such details. I'm just interested. And it sounds good to my ears. Okay, good. Yeah, the Genelex are generally made for reference purposes, so pretty much any of the models. But yeah, if you want to send that over, I can take a look and tell you the model number.
You apparently have it.
Oh, I apparently have it. I don't remember. I'm so sorry.
Well, I mean, you just got it.
Oh, I just got it. Oh, okay. Great. Be sure to ask that next time we meet, and I'll get that info for you. Okay. Good. What else is... oh, this is the last day that we get to wear the biodynamic holiday-themed headphones for this year. I hope everybody has a fantastic holiday season, whatever holiday you celebrate, and that you're able to spend a little time making some good sound, get some good time with family and friends, so on and so forth. Cherry, I don't have much information, but I think it's more of a rock band with guitars, drums, and bass, and with vocals. Okay. Whew, yeah. Freelance wouldn't be freelance without enough information. You're so right, Fajiri. You're so right. If they give you a lot of information and prepare you very well to do the job, then it's probably not just a simple freelance job. Yeah, I think if it's, I'm assuming that if they have guitars and bass and vocals and drums, that the guitarist and bass player will probably have their own amplifiers. So depending on the size of the venue, they might be good with those, and you're just going to have to balance them out as best you can. And then obviously the vocalist will need a microphone, and you might need, the drummer may or may not, I don't know, assuming they have acoustic drums, then you may not need them. Okay. Danny's onto something.
I want to highlight a conversation.
Danny wants to highlight a conversation. I've heard Genelex in treated spaces. I am not impressed. Okay, fair enough. Different sizes in different studios. I used to run a TV and radio station. We also had a mixing suite. I think they may be okay for mixing, but not listening. Yes, and that's an important distinction between reference monitors and speakers that are for listening, for playback, for concerts, for hi-fi, for just enjoyment. A lot of times the speakers that are for enjoyment are somewhat colored intentionally, and that's important to keep in mind. So the reference monitors are supposed to be brutally honest. That's their goal, is to be honest and make sure that you can hear where there's an issue in your mix, so you can fix that, so that when they play back, no matter which speakers, they're not going to have some problem playing back, some weird thing sticking out.
Okay, now we're going to go back to Fachiri's setup.
Now, back to Fachiri's setup. 2 shotguns.
And the shotguns are those.
Shotguns are NTG3 and MKH416. Okay, those are both pretty similar sounding. 2 shotguns, SM5758, 2 Octave MK0212s with super hyper and omni capsules. Okay. I think you're going to want one of the 58 on the vocalist, 57 if you need something on the drums. I'm not sure. I would probably reserve the...
Oh, this is funny.
And some lavs, but I'm pretty sure I don't want to use those for a live band. I'm pretty sure you don't. Anyway, I would say probably, bring what you have and figure it out when you're there. But I think if you do need to amp the drums, you could use the 2 octaves as overheads, just two overheads for the drums, period. That's it. And I'd probably put the super capsules on there, because you're going to be dealing potentially with feedback as well. The 58 I would put on the vocalist. I would hope that the guitarist has an amp. If you do need to mic them, you could use that 57 on them. then I don't know what to do with the bass player. Maybe one of the shotguns, but that would be, it's not really made for that. But that's probably how I would approach it. Fachiri, best of wishes to you. I am excited to hear how it goes. Danny, it's time to share the Judd taco recipe. Do you have anything to say on that matter?
I do. You are the keeper of the taco recipe.
I am the keeper of the taco recipe, Audio Buff. One thing about Audio Buff, he never gives up. LOL. You're right. He doesn't. In fact, he tests the little, when you're doing installed sound, one of the things you do is you have to usually wire in XLR cables so that you can get audio, say, for example, up on stage back to the mixing board. You don't have to run cable or run a snake every single time. So our friend Audio Buff tested some XLR floor boxes, the little boxes that you cut a hole in the floor and stage. You set them in there so that they're flush with the stage, and then you can run the XLR cables into those, plug them in, and then there's a little door that closes over the top of them. And the advantage of those, of course, over just literally putting an XLR connector on a little plate on the stage where the cable's sticking up is fewer tripping hazards. People are less likely to, if you don't have the box, people are more likely to trip over them. They're more likely to break your XLR cables and the ports and so on and so forth. He did some extensive testing over on his channel on floor boxes, and I would highly recommend you go have a look at those. That video. I don't remember, Audio Buff, if you want to share the name of that video in the chat, then people can find it very easily. Fachiri,
Yes,
shotgun stage left and right, 57 on the guitar and 58 on vocals.
That's Matt.
That seems like good. That seems like good advice as well. I'd be careful with those shotguns, though, just in relation to where the loudspeakers are. OSHA require the floor boxes now. Thank goodness. That's good. I'm sure that Audio Buff shows up at some churches where they don't have them and he has to install them. I'm sure. Thanks. Thanks, Matt. I'll do my best. I'm sure you will. And I think it'll be a good time. All right. Matt, we will get it out of him sometime, even if I need to get sound speeds involved. Oh no. That's a threat. Oh dear. Well, Audio Buff, next time you're in the Salt Lake, Park City areas of Utah, let me know. We'll have you over for tacos. Okay. Everybody get out there, make some great sound this week. We'll talk to you again next week. Take care, everybody.